And this is the re-recording of Esther Hanks and Lupe Gonzales. The interviewers were Moses Mora and Suzanne Lawrence, and I, M.B. Hanrahan, was present at the time. And let's see, the original date of this interview was June 12th, 2010, and I believe it occurred at the Bell Arts Factory in Ventura, California. So, Moses starts it out. I want to say, in the effort of preserving the legacy of Tortilla Flats, these two women have been very tremendous in their help. We are honored to have you both working for us, all that you have done, and we're honored to get your story as much as possible today. Generally, the first question has to do with your parents, how they arrived in Ventura, when they arrived in Ventura, what the parents did in terms of livelihood, and where you lived. Esther or Lupe, who would like to talk about your parents and how you got situated in Ventura? Esther. My mother, Antonia Diaz Gonzales, was born in Zacatecas, Villa Nueva. She came at the age of 3 years old with my grandma, Guadalupe Rivera, and my grandpa, Leonard Diaz. They paid 3 pennies to cross the border, and they camped down at the Yuma prison by the river. That's where they first stopped and camped for the night. What I understand, they traveled by car until they got to Los Angeles. Suzanne. And what year was that? Esther. Well, she was 3 years old, so that was 2003, 2006. Suzanne. And they had a car. Esther. Well, our family in Los Angeles that went to pick them up in Yuma had a car. They stayed there until they were picked up. They would watch the prisoners up there with all the guns and all that. That's what Mom told me. Then they were picked up by my aunt and her husband, and they brought them to Los Angeles. She stayed there and lived in L.A. and schooled in L.A. Mom went to the 3rd grade to learn English. At that time, nobody spoke English at home. She did, so she was the interpreter. Whenever they wanted to go to the store, they would take my mom. After that, Grandma and my Uncle Jimmy and my Aunt Lupe and my Aunt Sally, they were all born in L.A. After a while, I don't remember what year, they came to Ventura. First, my grandmother came to Ventura and settled on Figueroa Street. Moses. Do you know at what age your mother was? This was before she got married. Esther. This was 1933. She was born in 1903, and she got married when she was 18, but she didn't go to school. Moses. So she was probably a teenager or a young girl by the time they arrived in Ventura, you think? Esther. Yes. Moses. And you already had relatives in Ventura? Esther. Yes, they did. Moses. By what last name? Esther. Ramirez. That was my Aunt Ramirez and my Tia Mickey, and then my grandmother came, and she came, and they lived between Santa Clara and the Avenue. There was this little store, and there was an alley that I remember, and they had little houses, and Grandma used to live there with my Aunt Sally and my Uncle Johnny and my Aunt Lupe. And then Mom and Dad came to Figueroa Street with my sister Lucy, Vera, Rudy, and myself. Moses. These people you just mentioned are brothers and sisters of yours? Esther. Yes. Moses. So we are talking about your mother, and we haven't really talked about your father and how they met or when. Esther. Well, they met in L.A., and they were from the same area in Zacatecas. They got married in L.A., and they lived there for quite a while. We were born in L.A. Vera, Rudy, Lucy, and I were born in L.A. Then we moved to Ventura on Figueroa Street next to the Chapmans. The Ramona Chapmans then there in that area. After that, Grandma moved to 135 South Olive Street. They bought that house close. It was close to the 1930s. 1940s, they bought that land with my Uncle Johnny because he was looking in the fields for whatever they could get. So They bought that place on Olive Street. Moses. Okay, just for clarification, your parents were married in Los Angeles, and you were born in Los Angeles. How about you, Lupe? Esther. She was born in Ventura. Lupe. Made in Ventura. Moses. You were born in Ventura. Esther. She was born in Ventura. Suzanne. Esther, I have a question. You said your mother went through the 3rd grade. Esther. Yes. Suzanne. And then continued to live in Los Angeles till after she got married? Esther. Yes. Suzanne. Did she not want to go to school any further, or did her parents seem to need her at home? Esther. Yes, she was needed at home to take care of the kids and help Grandma. Suzanne. Did the other kids continue further with their education? Esther. Oh, yeah. Suzanne. It was just that she was the oldest child. Esther. She was the oldest, so she took care of them. Moses. She brought the English language to the family. Esther. Yeah. Lupe. You have to remember, back then, not like today, the families had quite a big family. There was 11 or 10 children, or 15 at times. So some of the older ones stayed home to take care of the rest of them. So that's where the schooling came in for my mother. Moses. In terms of work, what kind of work did your father do? Esther. He would work in the fields or as a gardener or something like that. Moses. And where does the name Gonzales come from? Esther. Gonzales? Moses. Your father was a Gonzales. Esther. Yes. Victor Villa Gonzales. Moses. Villa Gonzales. Esther. That's what I learned later on. Villa Gonzales, on my dad's side. On my mother's side, it was Diaz, Rivera Diaz. Moses. So, what age were you when you arrived in Ventura? Esther. Well, I was born in 1931, and I was little. She was born in 1936. She's pointing to her sister Lupe. The other one was born in 1933 or 34. Moses. So you were a toddler. Esther. I was a toddler, yes. Moses. For all intensive purposes, you grew up in Ventura. Esther. Oh yeah, but I was born in L.A. Moses. Well, then both of you can maybe tell us about that at that age, just growing up before starting school, or maybe your first couple years of school, the neighborhood you lived in. Who was around in terms of neighbors? Esther. Okay. My mom and dad separated after Lupe was born. We stayed, and he went back to L.A. because his family was there. My mom stayed in Ventura, and we moved in with my grandma on 135 South Olive Street in a 2-bedroom house. Lupe. It was a shack, I would say. Esther. Yeah, it was to the standards of the houses we live in. Yes. Lupe. That was a shack because there was no foundation. Back then, the codes. Moses. There were no codes. Lupe. Right. So, our house was maybe the size of from here to here with 4 rooms, and there was no foundation. There might have been a baseboard around, but I know one of the bedrooms, I could look down there where the wall was further set and see the dirt down below. Sometimes we were lying there, we would drop our wrappings of candy and throw it in there. And when we would think about it, we would go over there and say, okay, it's time to pick you up and throw you away. But it was very bare, our home. Poor. We had a wood stove, a 2-burner that Mom would cook on, and then it was also our source of heat. Later, we had a gas stove, but kept the wood stove. We had an ice box at first until we could afford a refrigerator. We had a telephone party line later, reaching into our teens. We listened to the radio programs on our Philco console, which I have in my home today, until TV came. If you would think about it, maybe Tijuana, about 20 years back maybe, well, that was our home. We used to wallpaper the walls, and when we were wallpapered, well, Let me stop myself. We had homemade cooking, homemade things that were sewn to put on our backs. Not too much of the store-bought items. That came later, when and if there was money. We survived from our garden or acre that we had planted all our vegetables, corn, etc., hens, chickens, the eggs. We had a goat. So there were very few items that we purchased, and but for the grace of Benny Enriquez, he carried us for many years on credit, where you don't see too much credit at the stores or supermarkets anymore. Lupe. Oh, this is from Suzanne. Lupe, you said you had a very small house, but you were on an acre of ground? Question mark. Lupe. Actually, it was 2 acres. My grandmother had 2 homes in L.A., and she bought this piece of property, which was the house on one corner, and then the alley, and then this other acre facing Santa Clara. And then in quotes, it's in parentheses, it says Patagonia. That was all used for gardening. Any kind of vegetables, corn, beans, potatoes, cucumbers, tomatoes, etc. Mom canned most vegetables we didn't use in mason jars sealed with paraffin wax and metal tops. We sometimes helped with the canning. Our cupboard of canned goods helped during lean times. Suzanne. Was it just your family garden, or was it a community? Lupe. No, it was our family community garden. So, whatever we grew there, we shared with other people. Most families had a small garden called victory gardens. That was the climate of the community, where everyone shared whatever they grew. If they had an abundance of whatever, they shared with another neighbor down the street, and that's what kept the community. It was an open community. Everyone helped themselves. That's what I can remember, that it would be a joy. There's joys and tears living in tortilla flats. The tears, I don't even want to go into that because it's hurtful. And just as I said before this interview, it brought up a lot of emotional baggage, which is okay. You live through it, and you survive. The one I felt for was my mother. How in the world did she do that? Suzanne. Did your grandmother help? Lupe. She was elderly, and she was sick. My mother helped my grandmother, the other way around. So, she had her hands full of children. My grandmother lived with us. My uncle who lived with us until he went into the service. And then when he came back, he brought back a wife to live with us there also. Suzanne. Did they all get along? All these people trying to make it? Lupe. There was no way we couldn't get along with it. Either we stood up for each other, or, we had discussions. Moses. Let me ask about kindergarten or first grade. I guess you were the first, Esther, to go to school. Esther. Okay. I went to school, but really, I was sickly all the time because I was skinny. I'm the middle one of the girls, and I was always puny. I weighed 3 or 4 pounds when I was born, and in those days, people didn't survive. I was told I was put in a shoebox and kept warm by the stove fire where they cooked, so I survived. But I was always skinny and helpless. Anyway, I survived, and I went to school, but I didn't finish kindergarten because I was too skinny. Moses. Where was that at? Lupe. That was Palm in Santa Clara, Palm Street Kindergarten. Esther. They said, no, you have to take her back. She's not ready for kindergarten. So I went back. Mom took me back, and I didn't go. I was 2 grades behind. Moses. From the first grade on, you were at Holy Cross? Esther. Holy Cross. Moses. It was 8 years there? Esther. 8 years there. I went to the high school at, I can't remember. Moses. Cabrillo? Esther. Cabrillo. You could walk all the way up Thompson and go straight up. I know that. Moses. Well, today it would be Cabrillo Junior High. Esther. Barbara would pick us up sometimes. Barbara Enriquez and Juanita and I would go to the high school. Moses. And so a few years later, did you follow the same pattern? Go to Palm Street Kindergarten and then Holy Cross? Lupe, yes. Moses, how about, do either of you remember the names of some of the nuns who were teaching? Esther, Sister Bernardus. Suzanne, everyone remembers her. Lupe, Sister Josepha, Sister Mary Catherine, or Sister Catherine Mary. But the most delightful, but not the easiest, was Sister Bernardus. She was a jewel. She was the only sister of a family of boys. She loved coaching. She loved the boys' sports. She was very forceful. All of them, I remember Sister Bernardus because she really laid down the law. She made us study, to whom I will be grateful for the rest of my life because she instilled in us the love of learning and books. Moses, I know even today at our meetings, while you are figuring out things in your head, I'm looking at my computer because I don't have that, even though I went to Holy Cross. Okay, so I want to ask this question too. Did you basically grow up bilingual? Were you good in Spanish and English? Esther, Spanish inside the home because my grandma, she couldn't speak English. So Spanish in the house, and outside we spoke English. Then when I went to high school, I wanted to learn how to write Spanish, but they said, no, your English is not very good, so you have to practice your English. So I never learned how to write Spanish. Lupe, there were things back then that were not as open. It wasn't verbal. I think there were certain things not acceptable in society and stuff, so we spoke English. I'm sorry I lost some of that culture. Some of the listeners here, when I listen to them, they have the culture that I have lost. How to make certain Mexican foods and different things that they do now and I had experienced eating when we were growing up. My mom fixed different foods, and I'm not good at that to this day. Moses, before we get too far into your adult life, let's stay focused on a minute on your growing up years. Maybe your teenage years, your high school years. Who were your friends? You already mentioned Barbara Enriquez, but in terms of recreation, what were you able to do? If you had any recreation time, and what like to do in terms of growing up? Esther, well, we didn't really go to parties or anything like that. We really didn't. I don't think I went to very many parties because we were always at home. Everything was kept close to the area where we lived. I remember staying with the kids living in our area, the Laras, the Ayalas, the Barrios. Lupe, you know, being poor has limitations in every facet of our lives. Suzanne, did anything change at any point where it got easier, like the older kids got jobs or your mother remarry? Esther, no, my mom didn't remarry because I remember her being with a man in a two-seater car with her in the front and my sister Lupe and me in the back, and I remember her saying, no, I'm not going to marry you because you will never treat my girls the same. But she did work. She worked washing dishes at the Maddox, which is now the Busy Bee restaurant. She also worked at the Farad Las Palmas chili factory on Ventura Avenue, and on the side, she took on ironing for white-collar professionals. Suzanne, Royce Maddox Restaurant. Esther, yes, she worked there. Then she worked cleaning houses on Figueroa. Lupe, the corner house. Esther, the corner house there. The white, pretty two-story house. She cleaned that house. It had a banister, and I can remember Mom saying, don't put your hands on that. I just polished it. Moses, so I have the advantage of looking at a map here and seeing where you lived. Pretty much your property was on the corner of Santa Clara and Olive, but your address was Olive. Is that the actual location where the circus in later years was held? Esther, no, across. Moses, across the street. Lupe, looking at the map. We are here. We're Gonzaleses. The carnival lot was right there. This was just a lot. From here, you could see a salad bowl. Suzanne, you were part of the cleaners. Lupe, when we would see that there was an accident, we would run out with our bags like crazy across the lot and grab all the fruits or vegetables. Moses, so the old circus grounds were more like at Salad Bowl Curve, and then back end would be on Olive Street. Lupe, Olive Street and Maida Street. Moses, well, you were growing up, they had the county fair and they had the circus. Do you have memories participating or going? Lupe, the circus, the carnival rather. Ester, the carnival. Lupe, they would come and ask us if they could take some of our water, and then they would give us free passes to go in there about every night to see the show. Esther, they came to get the water. Lupe, then Seaside Park was here, pointing to the map, and we went in here. Moses, oh, the park. Lupe, yes, Seaside Park entrance. Moses, not the fairgrounds. Lupe, which would be the fairgrounds. And from Olive Street, here's the back entrance. We would go in through there, pointing to the map, and then sometimes we used to climb over the fence and go to the fair to get in this way toward the river. The kids did that from Tortilla Flats. And you know what was funny? That the Barones lived right up against the railroad tracks, and you could hear that train whenever it came whizzing by. I don't know how that house stood there. Just like our house, and our house was near the tracks from the fork that went to Ojai to gather the oranges and bring them back. Here comes the train, rambling through, and our house that was built with no foundations withstood all the vibrations, and to this day, I do not know how in the heck that little loving shack made it. We used to have earthquakes back then, more so than now, and withstood the floods and the rains. When it used to rain so much, it stood. I don't know how, but by the grace of God, it was still standing there. It took the building of the now 101 freeway to bring it down. Moses, well, I think that's a situation unique to everyone who lived in the flats. The train was either in your front yard or in your backyard because it was an L-shaped neighborhood. Another question regarding the fairgrounds. As girls, did you have any interest going to see the baseball games? Lupe, oh yes. Moses, oh yeah, you did. So you went over there. Lupe, we were there as much as we could, the three of us, Juanita, Esther, and I. To this day, I am sports-minded. So Juanita and Esther, they're learning. Yes, we used to go to the baseball games, and when the camp was there, the Army base camp, they used to allow us the freedom of going through. It wasn't closed off, and we would go through the back entrance and down to the mouth of the river. That was the playground for all the people from Tortilla Flats. We used to picnic out there. Us, as small ones, we had the freedom of roaming around down there. Most of the kids had the freedom of roaming around, not like today. We had to be careful of the tide to cross over where Hobo Jungle was. Once you crossed on the other side, you were there for most of the day. That tide started coming in. Well, we were small and we didn't know how to swim, so we had to make sure we left that area to cross back. When the base was there, they used to have a rec hall, and they had nets out there for volleyball, basketball, and they allowed us to go in and participate and play volleyball. Suzanne, do you remember them marching? I understand they would march up to Ojai and back. Lupe, I personally do not remember that, but I do remember going up to the back entrance, and they had the barracks back there, and that's where my oldest sister met her husband. They used to march up and down the barracks, whatever they call it. Suzanne, guard duty. Lupe, she used to go up there and stroll over there and had something going. Moses, so your older sister who is still alive but not in good health, right? Lupe, Vera. Moses, that's Vera. Esther, Vera Gutierrez. Moses, so she met a soldier from where? Lupe, Texas. Moses, he was from Texas. Lupe, he was from Texas, a short Texan, and she's a tall Californian. Suzanne, did he stay or go back to Texas with her? Lupe, When he left the service, he came and married her, and they went to Texas. Then they came back. Moses. In the other direction from the baseball field, did you guys ever have occasion to go to Shore Acres, the trailer park over there? Lupe. We had friends that lived there. Moses. Do you have any stories or things to say? Lupe. The Laras lived there. They were a family of 4 girls and parents, and they lived in this small trailer. He worked for the railroad people. They were poor. I don't know how they survived there. I used to go with Dolores, who was closer in my age, and run down to a home past Figueroa where his boss lived. She would go knock on the door and ask for a severance check, $1 maybe, something to carry them through another day. In recalling my mind of the people that lived there, on the other side of the tracks, it was always considered truly tortilla flats because it was on the other side of the tracks. Anything on the other side of the tracks was poor. We were friends with the Ayalas, the Arenas, the Lorenzanas. The Marquez boys came in at one point with their father, and he raised them there. The Velarde family was on the other block end on Thompson from our property. They raised their family. Then the Barrios family, fun-loving people, the Barones, the Carmonas, the Elwells, the Rodriguez, and of course, Vincent Diaz's family. Everyone hung out with each other. The boys hung out with each other. This is from Lupe. Yes, it was a big nail that we would lay on the train tracks. And then when the train would pass by and then you saw the shape of it, it was in the shape of a sword. Then we would play back and forth with the swords, not knowing how sharp they were. Other people told us about Shore Acres, the trailer park there, about seeing outdoor films and movies. Was that before or after you were growing up? Esther. That was Beverly Harris. She's Beverly Comax. She lived at Shore Acres, and she's the one that told me about seeing the movies that they used to rent down there on Saturday nights. Moses. As young girls or teenagers, did you see films anywhere? Were you allowed to? Lupe. Mission Theater, the American Theater, which was on Main Street, around the 400, 500 block. Just before you got to the Ventura Theater and, of course, the Mayfair Theater. We used to like going to the Mission Theater because they had the chapters of the movies going on there during the week. We went to see one chapter, and then you would go see the next one because it was like a continuing soap opera. But in order to go to the movies, we had to have money. I forget at that time how much it cost. We used to go and gather soda pop bottles. We recycled. We were early eco-green way back then. We did everything possible that they are doing now. Back then, we'd go around and pick up bottles and take them to the store and get some money. Then we would go to the movies. If Mom had a little bit of money, usually the first of the month, she allowed us to go to the movies, but that was our big pastime. Or going to the park, Plaza Park across from the post office. That used to be a big area for most of the families to gather for picnics and to take their children. That was a big park there. The library, there was nothing to do at times, and I loved to read, so I used to hang out at the library. Moses. Is that in the same location as it is today? Lupe. Yes. The library today is a modern setup in front. Back then, there was a service station on the corner, and the building was set back. It was all brick, beautiful, with ivy. It almost reminds me of the same architecture as the Ventura High School, how that used to be. So I enjoyed going there. We used to hang out at everybody's house. We would do something or other. Moses. So after Holy Cross, where did you go to the 9th grade? Esther. Cabrillo. Moses. You went to Cabrillo. Lupe. When I went to Cabrillo, it was the high school, and I think it had 2 more years to go. They changed the college to Ventura High School, and the Ventura College, I think, was a couple of Quonset huts attached, and part of the buildings were used for the college before they built the college. So I attended school, junior at Ventura High School, which is now Cabrillo, 1 year, and then the following year I went to Ventura High, which is the Ventura High on Main Street. Moses. So the first year it was in existence, you were there. Lupe. Yes. Moses. And your graduating year, both of you? Esther. I graduated in 1952 from the college now. Lupe. I had a GED. Moses. Okay. I'm trying to get an idea during the war years. You were younger. You were pre-teens. Lupe. Oh, yes. I remember one thing about the war years. Every person had somebody in the service, and they got a flag to put in the window with so many stars. I think there were 2 at a time, or 3, I'm not sure. There was my uncle, our brother-in-law, and my brother, so there were 3 stars. Another thing, during the war, they used to have raids, which they called raids. When the sirens came, everybody had to turn off the lights, and the black shades came down, and you couldn't put on any lights until they sounded the sirens again. So that was kind of scary as a young person back then. You didn't know what was really going to happen. You just had to be prepared. Also, women's nylons. What is it? There were quotas. You would make do with what was available during the war years. Suzanne. Rations. Lupe. Rations, yes. There were rations in food products, and also there were rations with women's nylons because it's what they made parachutes out of. When my uncle left the service, he was in the Army, he came home with a parachute. And there's the parachute. A beautiful parachute. Feel the material, and that's what it was. It was made from nylon stockings. Back then, you didn't wear pants. You wore dresses or skirts. Very dressed up. And when you went out in public, you were ready to be out in public. No shorts or pants or casual wear. Well, they had to do something about their stockings and legs. So what a lot of them did is they had specific cake makeup, and they would put the cake makeup on their legs, and I guess with an eyebrow pencil they would draw a line. Well, back then, the stockings had a little line in the back, and it would drive the women crazy because it was never straight. It was always a wiggly line. Women were so vain back then. They'd have to have that line straight on the back of their legs, and that's what they put up with and sacrificed their nylons for the war. Esther. The shoes. You got stamps for the shoes. Lupe. Oh, the stamps for food. Esther. We had so many in our family, they gave us stamps because we couldn't afford to buy shoes, so Mom would trade for something else, for the lard. Suzanne. Did she do all the sewing, or did one of the older girls do the sewing? Lupe. My mother, like I said, she was very resourceful. She made the glue for putting up the wallpaper. She painted her chairs, repainted whatever it was to make it look nice. She had a sewing machine. Esther has the sewing machine, which is a singer, to this day. She would collect the material from the big sacks of flour for the tortillas, that piña flour sacks. She made those into kitchen linen. Suzanne. They make wonderful dish towels. Lupe. Dish towels, right. Clothes, aprons. She made our lingerie. We wore boxer shorts. Moses. That's a first, in terms of admitting it. Lupe. I mean, you want a story? There's a story. The slips were out of linen. She salvaged everything and made it into something different. She was very creative and resourceful. I think when we were in our teens, they had a program through the schools. If we wanted to work during the summer, we would get school permits to go to work. We happened to have an aunt who worked in the old Goleta packing house, the Lemon House. So Esther and Juanita and I went and stayed with her during the summer, and we got jobs at the Goleta packing house. Esther and Juanita were packers. They made a little bit more money. I was a grader, so I made less money. So we salvaged our money, and that's what helped pay the bills at Benny's Market. We used to come home on weekends and give Mom part of the money, and the rest we would save for the rest of school clothes or whatever we needed. Suzanne. Who cut your hair? Was there one person who was good at it, or did you trade with a neighbor? Lupe. I think whoever needed a haircut, she would just get the scissors and hand it to one of the siblings, and they would just cut it straight across. Straight bangs. Either that or braided. We wore braids because it was the easiest way to keep it neat. Like I said before, there was no money, no real money, to go out and pay someone to do the job. If we could do it ourselves, we did it. Suzanne. What did your mother do for shampoo? Did she make shampoo? What we used was a lot of soap and vinegar, which to this day, once in a while, I'll use because it leaves your hair squeaky clean. When we had dandruff, we used the eucalyptus leaves. We used to walk to the back entrance of Seaside Park, and there were eucalyptus trees lined up across the tracks, and we would go there and gather branches and come home and boil them. At the time, we didn't have a water heater, so we just had to boil our water outside. There was a big pit, and you would put the bandeja on top of it, heat our water for our baths, or whatever. So that's what we did for the shampoo. We collected rainwater back then. It was beautiful rainwater back then. It was so clear and left your hair again so squeaky clean. Suzanne. Did you brush your hair with soda and salt? Lupe. Yes, we did what we had to. If there was no money for articles that women need, we had to substitute. Moses. Where did you live in relationship to Don Files Market, or did you go there? Lupe. Oh yes, I think I marked it on the map. Moses. When you were talking about Benny's Market, are you talking about the original market across from the park? Esther. No, the one I went to was right on Thompson. Lupe. Don Feliz, he was an okay guy. He helped us out quite a bit too. Just like Benny, he helped a lot of people. To this day, I have to be grateful to Barbara's dad because he had such a neat way and he was such a giving person, especially helping us. He was a great guy. Moses. So, no brother, right? Esther. One brother. Moses. One brother. Younger or older? Esther. Older. He was the second one. Vera and Rudy. They called him El Gallito. Lupe. Gallito when he was small, and Gallo when he was older. Esther. I didn't know that Jimmy knew him at all until he mentioned, "Oh, I know him. They played together and they went to the river together." Lupe. He was just a handsome fellow and everybody wanted a piece of him. Moses. Should we talk about your work life? Well, you did talk some about the packing house in Goleta. Esther. We worked in the fields. Lupe. We worked in the apricots and the walnuts. Esther. We worked over there by which is now Lemonwood, across from the mall. We worked there. Moses. Lemon Grove. Esther. Yeah, Lemon Grove. Then we worked where the drive-in used to be, Blue Jay. Lupe. Where I live, it is known as Walnut Park, and it was all you could see from Mills Road. It was all walnut groves or lemon groves. When you took a bus, there was one bus, we took it to 5 Points, and then you had to walk all the way down to the county medical center. Moses. What about the west side of town? Were there any orchards up the avenue? Lupe. Canet Ranch. We worked there. They used to pick us up in a truck, and other families preferred to camp out there. I think the Barrios camped out there. They would give us a sharp knife, and you would split the apricot and take the pit out and lay it on a table. That was my mother and sisters, 6 of us. So most of the families were there in this open shed doing apricot pits. Whenever we would finish, we would call out, "Tray," and they would come and punch your card. That's how you got paid, by the number of punches on your card. I forget which family it was. I used to curse them because I could hear in the distance over there, "Tray," every 15 minutes. "Tray." And here we were, working in our little corners and in the middle, but we did what we had to do. And the walnuts, everyone knew in September, when they went back to school, who had worked in the walnuts because your hands were all black from the walnuts. Suzanne. What did you use to try to get that stain off? Was there anything at the time? Lupe. You could use bleach or vinegar, but it really wouldn't come off. In time it would, but you could try to keep your hands closed, but pretty soon you had to open them up, and there they were, black. When we worked in this lemon grove, we stayed there at this one place. Again, the Barrios family stayed there, and the other families, either the Carmonas, I can't think of all the families that worked out there, but we used to go in the fields. In the morning, Mom would make burritos of anything she could because we would eat out there. We didn't get a break. We just took our lunch with us. A lot of the times it was papas, beans, and eggs. It was sure good. They tasted good. We would heat them up on the twigs of the walnut wood and eat them nice and warm. I know who else went. It was the Barone family because they had a daughter, Mary, who was nonverbal. We used to be afraid of her, poor thing, but they were such a hard-working family. We all worked together. Every family would take a row, and there we would go with the sacks. I was small then. When it got too heavy, heaven forbid, we had to help each other fill up the sack, and that's how they paid us, by the sack. They would give you a number, and you slipped it on. I remember to this day, one of my older sisters, Lucy, it was very close to lunchtime or closing time or something, but she put me in a sack that wasn't even done. She just put me in a sack with the walnuts and loaded me up and closed the bag. So when they came around to pick up the sacks, they picked me up and put me on the truck. Then my mother was looking around. She said, "Where's Lupe?" And nobody was saying nothing until she looked at my sister and says, "Well, she's over there on the truck." What did your brother do? What kind of jobs? That's from Suzanne. Esther. He picked apples at Arnez Ranch. He cleaned cars sometimes and picked lemons. Lupe. Any manual labor that was available. Moses. He was too young for the war, right? Esther. No, he went to World War II. Moses. He was of military age during World War II. He went to Europe, the Philippines. Esther. I don't remember. What I had heard from the guys, that he went to the service with him, I heard that he had gone overseas. What I don't understand is he was in a foxhole, and one of those shells hit the foxhole. When he woke up, he wasn't hurt, but his buddy was decapitated. So he was always thinking about that. And when they came home, there was no treatment for anything like that. Moses. He probably had a concussion, and I think in the old days they used to say you were shell-shocked, which essentially is post-traumatic stress syndrome. Lupe. He became nonverbal after that. Moses. He just withdrew and went into himself. Okay, so let's talk about, I guess, you first, Esther. Once you graduated, what happened in your life? Esther. When I graduated, I tried to find a job. I couldn't find anything because they wouldn't believe I was 21. Moses. You still looked small? Esther. I was still small, so I was happy that I got to go live with my aunt and Uncle Tony in Santa Barbara. I got a job down there working in a dime store. At that time, Juanita and Lupe decided to go up there in the summertime. We lived in a little front house, and we lived together for about 3 months. Then they decided to come home, and I stayed up there, and I worked at the dime store. At the time, the braceros started coming in, and they didn't have people speaking Spanish in the stores or the banks. So my aunt went to the store, and a bracero asked her if she could help him. Then the store manager looked at her and asked if she knew somebody that could work in the store. My Spanish was very good at the time. It was very good, because I only spoke Spanish living with my aunt and uncle, with my uncle and Aunt Lupe. So I got hired there. Then from there, I went to work at the Mission Theater as a cashier part-time. Esther. I was still small, so I was happy that I got to go live with my aunt and my Uncle Tony in Santa Barbara. I got a job down there working at a dime store. And at the time, Juanita and Lupe decided to go up there in the summertime, And we lived in a little front house, and we lived together for about 3 months. Then they decided to come home, and I stayed up there, and I worked in the dime store. At the time, the braceros started coming in, and they didn't have people speaking Spanish in the stores or the banks. So my aunt went into the store, and a bracero asked her if she could help him. Then the store manager looked at her and asked if she knew somebody that could work in the store. My Spanish was very good at the time. It was very good because I only spoke Spanish, living with my uncle and Aunt Lupe. So I got hired there. Then from there, I went to work at the Mission Theater as a cashier, part-time. Moses. The Mission Theater in Santa Barbara, Ester. Santa Barbara. Then, after that, I stayed there for about a year, came back home, and Lupe and Juanita were both married. I came home to be with Mom and to try and work in Ventura. I went to Woolworths. One of the ladies shopping came to me and asked me something in Spanish, and I said, "Sorry, I don't work here." And the manager, Carmichael, heard, and he said, "Oh, you speak Spanish?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm a Mexican girl. Can't you tell?" And he said, "No. Well, come back in February and I'll have an opening." And I told my mom I would have a job in 2 months and I would be back to stay. I came back, I got a job, and I worked for Woolworths until I got married. I got married, I went to Oxnard with my husband, and I had a son, Moses. Okay, we're going to talk more about that and your husband, but let's catch up with Lupe. Is this going to be a brief story? Lupe: Yes, very brief. I got married in 1953. Moses: To a Ventura guy? Lupe: Yes, he was raised here. He was related to the Hinojostro family. Robert, Mary Hinojostro. They lived on Front Street, which is now the Crown Plaza. I married and found myself in 1957 needing to go to work. I didn't find opportunities here in Ventura, so I went to Oxnard. I was fortunate in finding a job in a jewelry store with no experience. They hired me as a bookkeeper, which I only had bookkeeping classes in school, so I was a bookkeeper with them in a jewelry store. Suzanne: Just learn as you go. Lupe: It was all a bluff by the grace of God. Help me, because I had 2 children to support, so I went to work for them. My first day, I went to work. Of course, back then, you had to dress up, and especially in a jewelry store, you had to wear a skirt or a dress with the high heels. Well, little did I know that on my first day, they were going to have a promotion, which back then, they would give away things, and the people had to line up all the way around the corner. Well, I wore heels, and when I got home that night, I said, "No way will I wear heels." So the next day, I wore these loafers. Remember the loafers with the pennies in them? Yeah, that was from Suzanne. Lupe: Well, that didn't look too cool, but I said, "Oh, my feet were killing me the night before." So I took those shoes and started working, and my boss looked down at my feet, and I thought, "Oh God, I can't do that again." So then I would take the loafers on the side and wore the heels and learned that profession for 25 years with that store. It was right across the street from the post office. I learned a lot there, and to this day I tell everybody, don't go into retail because you work long hours, especially at Christmas time. You can work 10 and 12 hours a day. By the time I got home to my kids, it was 10 or 11 o'clock, so I didn't get to see too much of them during the holidays. They closed the door in 1982, and I was semi-retired a bit by then. Moses: Okay, you were working in Oxnard, but living in Ventura. Lupe: In Ventura, I used to take the Greyhound bus back then. Day in and day out, and they were never on time. So, if the city buses were running and I lost the last connection, I would have to walk home. If I was living on the avenue, I would have to get to California so I could take a shortcut and walk on Poli and walking in heels. Suzanne: How old were your kids when you started doing all this? Lupe. They were 2, 3 years old. Suzanne. Did your mom take care of them? Lupe. I had different people taking care of them, relatives and friends. Suzanne. It must have been crazy. Lupe. It was. Moses. So I think we've advanced in years, so we better get back to your story. You married before your older sister married, right? Lupe. Right. She was the last to marry. Moses. Your husband was a Ventura guy? Esther. No way. Moses. No way. Esther. He was born in Missouri and raised in Michigan. His mom lived in the trailer park across from us, and she worked at the Woolworths. Lupe. That parking lot where the carnival was, that became a trailer park. Moses. Okay, that was around Maida and Garden Street. Esther. She lived there. She worked at Woolworths, and I worked at Woolworths. She worked in the restaurant part, and I worked in the retail. Moses. So he was Esther. He came from the service. I met him, and we got together. Lived in Ventura for a while, 1955, 1957, and in 1935 to 1937, then in 1939, we moved to Oxnard, and we bought our home in Oxnard. Moses. Is that the house I visited you at? Esther. At the same house. Moses. That was way out there. I thought in those days, in the 50s, Oxnard ended at about Woolley Road. That was way south. Esther. It was way out there. The bus used to come in on the next street, Paula Street. I never drove when my husband was alive, but it was right around the corner, so that was fine with me. Then they moved it to the next street, and so now you have to go all the way down Channel Islands to take the bus. Moses. But there were a lot of fields, a tremendous amount of fields, I would imagine. Esther. There were a lot of fields. Pleasant Valley fields, Lemonwood fields across the high school. Moses. What kind of work did your husband do? Esther. He worked at Magoo. He worked in the garden and in mechanics, servicing the trucks and cars. Moses. And what were you doing in terms of work? Esther. I worked for Woolworths. Moses. You were still at Woolworths. Esther. In 1986, I quit Woolworths. In 84, Mom got sick, and then my husband got sick too. My husband died in 1989. Moses. And your mother? Esther. In 1986. Moses. So by the late 50s, you were both in the Oxnard area. Lupe. I was working in Oxnard, but I lived in Ventura. The only time I lived in Oxnard was the year I lived with my sister. Other than that, I lived in Ventura. Moses. Given your situations, did you ever go to the Green Mill Ballroom? Esther. When we were kids. Moses. When you were kids. Esther. Yes, because we had... Well, now remember this. This was the time where girls did not go out by themselves. They had to be escorted. Especially the Mexican people. They had to escort their girls. They were not allowed to go out at night, and they had to be escorted. So, Mom would take us girls, Lupe, Vera, and I, to the Green Mill. We would take my Aunt Sally, my Aunt Lupe, and that's how we went to the Green Mill. Moses. Which dances? The rock and roll or the Mexican dances? Esther. Harry James, or whoever was playing. Lupe. The big bands. Moses. The big bands. So, you saw some of the big bands. Can you name some of the performers? Esther. I remember Harry James. Lupe. All the popular ones back then. I remember we used to babysit for these women that lived in an apartment house across from the Green Mill Ballroom. They had 2 boys we used to babysit. So, through the back window, we used to look down and see all the people all dressed up. They were always dressed up with their best clothes. We could hear the music going on. The Green Mill was a great place, but another great place was the Ocean House or the Beach House, which became the Armory. Suzanne. The bathhouse? Lupe. The bathhouse. Now that was a terrific place. That's when the families also went there, and then we hung out there, chaperoned. We used to dress up. The women had their nice formals and their gowns. Even if they were poor, they had a couple of dress-up things. Suzanne: I'm glad your mom got to have some fun. Lupe: we loved music, and if you love music, you will have fun. I loved the big band sound. Suzanne: did you jitterbug? Lupe: all that. I love music. The only thing I don't really like is that hard rock. You can't understand the lyrics. Moses: brag about your kids. Esther: I have one son and one grandson and 2 granddaughters. They live up in Templeton on 10 acres of land, and they raise sheep. 2 of the girls raise show sheep. The oldest one, Sarah, has graduated from Chico, and she's going to be showing people about sheep and pigs, and Amy is following in her footsteps. Michael, he is into computers. Suzanne: do you drive up to see them? Esther: I used to. I did until last November when I had an accident. I had never drove until my husband died, and then I made up my mind to learn how to drive in 1989. So I was driving until November when I had that accident and hit somebody. They didn't die, but I don't want to hurt anybody, so now I don't drive. Suzanne: well, you can hitchhike. Esther: oh, I have nieces and nephews that are taking me everywhere, so I don't have to worry about that. Moses: Lupe, what about your kids? Lupe: well, first let me say, I'm glad Esther had only one child. Moses: okay, that says a lot. Lupe: because she is our mother hen. She is our protector. Everything else you can consider her, she is there for us. I have 2 daughters now. I had 2 sons. One passed away in 2003. The 2 daughters, they are both employed and going through the economy and the possibility of not having a job. Both of them have been working 15 and 20 years. One is with the insurance company, WellPoint, and the other is with Verizon. They are still employed and they have children. I believe I have 7 grandchildren. I lost track of the great-grandchildren. I think it's 7, 8, 11, I don't know. Some of them are in Oxnard, and one is here in Ventura. So they are all close around the family, and we have our reunions. We do what we can around issues of family life. Moses: you mentioned earlier in the interview Barbara Enriquez Duran, some of the people on the committee, like Bobby Mina, Mary Diaz. Did you know them growing up? Lupe: I heard some of the names, the Minas, and I heard of the Chacons, and I heard of the Diaz and the Badias. I went to school with Mary Diaz. Of course, in conversation you pick up with whoever was talking. It was such an open society and commingled. The doors were always open. In this day and age, we lock our doors. And back then, our doors were open. And, hi, comadre, or whoever, and chit-chat. You offer them whatever, tea, coffee, even a burrito. That's the part I love, going back then, when things were so simple and not so stressful as they are today. The boundaries are not like the way they are now. Unlimited boundaries back then, and that is what I miss. Suzanne: the simple life. Lupe: everyone helping everyone. Now it's different. I don't even know some of the neighbors where I live. I don't see them. Questions from the audience. Mary Diaz: related to the prom. Lupe: Mary Diaz and I went to the prom. Back then, as girls growing up, what you do, you do. It's a small town, and we used to hang out. We used to hang out at the Teen Time, the building right off the main entrance of the fairgrounds, right next to the baseball stadium. There was maybe a ping pong table and a jukebox, and the guys used to hang out. We used to have the guys from the Chiques come, and the guys from Santa come out, and the guys from Sadi, and the guys from Ventu come out. Of course, there was always squabbles between the guys. They would come out and chase the Ventura girls. We happened to pair up with the Santa Paula guys. We used to just hang out at Margie Perez's house. She was very open, and her house was open. So the guys would just drive up, and whoever had a car at that time would hang out there. Mickey Marquez, Margie Gabaldon, the Barrios, the guys from Santa Paula, would come out and hang out also at Tippy Barrios' house. Suzanne: were you allowed to go to Santa Paula? Lupe: everything was under the table. It was all harmful. Moses: harmful or harmless? Lupe: harmless, yet harmful to a certain point because I didn't know what the heck I was doing. I just wanted to be part of the group. You know, peer pressure and all that. You just want to be included. I was such a mousy thing back then. I just went along with the group. I know when Margie had her party, I remember this one instance. Emily, Mickey, Marquez came over. The Emily Marquez of the Marquez family on Front Street. They used to come and hang out in front of the house. Back then, the big thing was, oh, not like today, was, hey, smoking. They would come out with their cigarette. They'd pass that cigarette around. Well, when it gets to a certain point, if it gets too small, somebody needs to get a hairpin. We used to do our hair in pin curls, and we used to have pins and just put it on the tip of the cigarette so you could take a puff and pass it around. Moses: what kind of cigarette was this? Lupe: probably a Lucky Strike. I don't know. I just wanted to be part of the crowd, and I went along. Then, when this guy from Santa Paula, Julian Reyes, invited me to go to the prom, I felt like I needed to refuse him because there was no way I could afford a prom dress. All the girls at that time were having their dresses made at Anita's, a dress shop in Oxnard. So I didn't know how to get out of it, and Mary said, oh, you got to go with him. So all we had in the house was this dress, and it was made for Juanita because she was the May Queen at Holy Cross back then. To this day, they still have a May procession. So Mom had this pretty blue dress made, and that's the only thing that was there. I asked my mom, can I go? Can I go? There's no money, babe. Oh, I'll fix this dress. I became a fashion designer, and I got this dress, and I looked at its blue netting, so I redesigned the netting to this god-awful dress. Of course, I also needed a slip, and there again, Mom had made a slip out of that linen stuff from the La Pina sacks. And then we go to the affair with this dress. Moses: who did you go to the prom with? Lupe: Julian, Mary Diaz, and her friend Roy. But first, Julian had to come and ask my mother before I even went. He had to come and knock at the door and ask my mother permission. And she said, yes, but you bring her home at 9 o'clock. I said, 9 o'clock? Oh, yes, yes. So that when he came knocking at the door to pick me up, and of course he was dressed very sharp in a vest. I don't know if it was a tuxedo or a suit, and then there I was, stuck with this netting and this flared dress. Oh my God, I never felt so bad. I just went into the car. Of course, all these girls had these gorgeous strapless dresses above the knee and below the knee, and they had their corsage. Mary Diaz was a knockout in her prom dress. In her casual clothes, she was a walking ad for Sweater Girl. I really didn't know how to dance because we didn't go out. So, the prom was at Santa Paula High School. The guys back then, they used to go out in the parking lot, and they'd have these liquor bottles and take a swig and pass the bottle around. I remember going to the restroom and having a hard time lifting my long dress with all these layers of material to sit. I couldn't get the dress up. All these other girls had short dresses. Then I went out and we started dancing. Thank God it was a slow one because I could bluff. And then here I am taking the lead instead of him leading me. I'm leading. Oh, I can't remember what happened after that. Moses: wait, you mentioned the word franzy. Franzy? What language is that? What does frenzy mean? Fancy beyond fashion? Lupe: fancy. A lot of foo-foo. Suzanne: we all know. Suzanne: Moses: okay, the transcriber will know what you're talking about. Suzanne: was it awful? Or was it just a change with so much going on that you remember it well? Lupe: oh, I have a great memory, thank God. There are things that you hold that it's an emotional memory that makes an impression so you can remember those things. It also changes your life. I came home and it wasn't 9 o'clock. It was after. She didn't have a key, but had this little door latch that she used to lock the door, so I had to knock on the door, and she had to answer. I walked in, and I was scared as a mouse, and I sneaked in and put everything away and went to bed. But I did nothing wrong. Those were good memories. Suzanne: well, you are certainly not mousy anymore. Lupe: no, and I just discovered that several years ago. I felt I never had anything to contribute. I thought I was just a listener. Now, I'm at a point in my life, if I'm going to do it, I'd do it, and I'd just be me. Whoever existed back then was someone else, as far as I'm concerned. Suzanne: was there something specific, or you just grew up? Lupe: probably just grew up and faced reality. Moses: that kind of leads into what I wanted to ask, because both of you have the spirit of community. You do work in the communities. Where did that come from, or when did that begin? Esther: that began with my grandmother. Grandma didn't speak English, but she always helped everybody. The homeless, the tramps, they would stop by, and I guess they had a little sign that they would give the house that was hit. Suzanne: they marked the gate or something. Esther: but Grandma always fed one, whatever we had, whether we had tortillas or not. But they would stop by. We never locked the doors like we do now. She always had the door open for that and would share whatever we had. Beans, rice. Grandma and Mom. She could take a pound of meat and feed all of us. That's 11 of us, 6 kids and 5 grown-ups. They would take a potato or two and make a skillet and feed us all. Suzanne: did you ever go fishing or do any hunting? My family lived on fishing and hunting. Esther: my brother and my uncle would go fishing. They would bring the fish or clams, and they would do that. Like I said, we grew most of our own corn, and we planted every year. Us girls helped with the planting of green beans, corn, tomatoes, and the cactus. We had cactus, nopales. Suzanne: yeah. Esther: we fixed nopales every way you can think of. Of course, in the back we had a chicken coop with chickens, so we had eggs every day. When Mom or my grandma wanted to make something, they would just go to the coop and get a chicken. There goes the chicken without the head. Lupe: I remember very vividly when we had company coming from L.A. She fixed something special, enchiladas or chickens. She would go out in the backyard near the pit that heated up our water, and she would just get one. A healthy, good, plump chicken. Then she would get it by the neck and just turn it around and toss it to the ground. She would wait for the chicken to drain out, and then, with her apron on, she would sit there and would start plucking the feathers, then boiling the chicken before she cooked it up. I would always get a kick out of watching her, because here's this little lady, the size of Esther in build, doing all this stuff. She painted, she cooked, she did this and that, she did everything, and she survived. To this day, she is my hero. She epitomizes the barrio mother of today. There are a lot of barrio mothers in existence today going through what my mother went through. They're able to survive on what they've got. Suzanne: and keeping everyone else alive. Lupe: yes. Suzanne: she was the one you counted on. Lupe: well, there was no one else. There was no father. I never knew my father. He must have passed away when I was like 1 or 2 years old. I don't have any memories of him except at the funeral. Moses: that was something I was going to ask. When you were young and someone died, where were they buried? Lupe: back then they would have something at the house with the body there. Moses: the velorio? Lupe: not the velorio. They would just have something a day or two when the neighborhood would come. I remember our living room, we had Grandma, and then she was taken to Reardon's. At that time, Reardon's was a Victorian house that was set back a little ways before you got to the old mission. And they had the rosary there, and then she was buried at Ivy Lawn. Back then, you were allowed to travel like a parade with a policeman escort. That has changed. Now, everyone goes their own way to the cemetery. I don't think back then that they had cremation. Moses: okay. One last round of questions. if there's any other stories. Ester. Oh, right there, that empty lot where we planted the corn and vegetables. Grandma would lease and let people from this church, when they had their revival, put a tent up there. I remember listening to them praise the Lord for a week. Moses. They were not Catholics. Ester. No. Suzanne. Pentecostal. Ester. Yes. Moses. Spanish speaking? Ester. Yes. Lupe. We used to sneak into the back to look at what they were doing. They were rolling on the ground. Ester. Holy rollers is what we used to call them. Lupe. But we used to rent that out. Suzanne. I think I remember that. Lupe. In talking about churches, I forgot the Olivet Baptist Church. That was very prominent back then, as it is today. They were located on Santa Clara Street. Moses. Yes, they were just down the street on the other side of Olive. Lupe. There were 3 of us, and we used to go to church, and we had to pass it. And I used to enjoy watching those people because they were dressed to the hilt in their Sunday best. The hat, the gloves, the shoes. Immaculate. Moses. This was a Baptist church? Lupe. A Baptist church. And then we'd get home, and we would see them leave. Immaculately dressed. Moses. Very dignified people. Lupe. Right. They are very joyous people. That left an impression on me, the Olivet Baptist. Moses. I would like to say that this has been a very delightful afternoon, and thank you all very much. This has been a great contribution to our archives to have your stories like this. Thank you everyone who stayed and listened. One more question from the audience regarding the flood in the late 1930s. Esther. I remember the water coming down Olive Street. I can still see it going down the railroad tracks on both sides. They warned us before it came that we had to leave. You just have to leave. You have to leave. The only one that wouldn't leave was my grandma. My grandma said, nope, I'm not leaving because I'm staying here with my house. She had canaries, so she wouldn't leave. So my mom took us up, and we waded in the water around a corner. There was a metal fence, and the water was just gushing through. A bus took the people to the bathhouse for the night. The water did go through Tortilla Flats, but not a drop damaged our house.